Interlude 2. Breach 3. Second Wall. 26th of Metzli, Imperial Year 4006. High Marshal Tlaloc had not slept in nearly 5 days. Rest had been hard to come by even before the Ugg counterstrike, as the scheduled end of bombardment closed in, and the assault drew nearer. Try as Tlaloc might, worries over the silence from the distant south and his own fitness for the position of High Marshal had often kept him pacing the sparse little farmstead home his men had fitted up as quarters for him behind the lines, rather than sleeping in the modest wicker bed. Then, the Ugg's unexpected night push on the guns had thrown him into true dread. They had not crippled the Sholoshaishan batteries. Perhaps a fifth of the largest siege guns were beyond repair, and a fair few more were maimed, but they would be back in action within a couple weeks. Already, word had come from the foundries of Tepeklan and elsewhere that the equipment could be replaced, and the trains would have them back at High Marshal Tlaloc's disposal within a month. Indeed, the capital was suggesting he would have more guns by the time the shelling of Sirgirkar was begun in full than he'd had at the outset of the campaign. After all, if the Lautani had arrived with better equipment by then, he would want all the firepower he could muster to crush them underfoot. No, Sholoshaidi's capacity was not what troubled him. The Empire could weather any storm, so far as its resources and material were concerned. It was Tlaloc's own doubts which dogged him in the later hours of the night, when all fell quiet save the artillery. Whatever happened to set back the legions in this forsaken land, they would endure. Whatever was happening down in Milikatlan, the folk of the Lord of War would endure. It was Tlaloc who felt the squeeze of the nation's eyes upon him even when he skulked alone in a barren peasant's bedchamber, with the wicker and blue-daubed fetishes of lion-folk savages about him. It was he who might not survive the turbulent times to come. When the counter to the Ugg had been set loose, the entire command structure had understood things might get away from them. On the ground, in the heat of fighting, it was often difficult to restrain the men, something Tlaloc had seen firsthand in the last war down in Eztlan. And yet then, he had been a lower officer. Now he was in command of perhaps the largest fighting force ever put into the field, not a leaf adrift on the stream, but the engineer charged with redirecting the current. The plan, concocted even as orders were being given for the Ugg to be pushed back to their holes in the second wall, was to withdraw themselves and continue bombardment for another few days at least. On the northern 3 breaches, this might have been feasible. The Ugg out in no man's land had been engaged, heavy casualties had been inflicted, and their reliable old guns had been captured in the grassland. But significant numbers of the lion folk had, in all 3 cases, managed to escape, and rejoin their comrades in their nation-spanning fortress. The southernmost breach, though, was a different story, not due to any failure of the storied Sholoshaishan legions in the field, but rather, as was so often the case, due to a crushing success. There, the legions had not just engaged the Ugg, but entirely encircled them. So far as High Marshal Tlaloc had been told, none of the enemy's southern strike force had made the wall. They had been cut down in the fields, and when at last the broken remnants of them were slaughtered, the men of Sholoshaidi, already fighting under fire in the shadows of the battered second wall, had organically began an assault on the southern breach. At great cost, they had taken it, wading the shallows of the hinterland canal and raising the black-and gold banner of Tepeklan over the gaping wound in the bastion. And reserves had been called up to reinforce, and Ektal flamethrower units were shifted in to clear tunnels, and scout planes were sent out over the lower wall to probe the innards of Gunug beyond. All this had happened within an hour of dawn. The other 3 strike groups hadn't even been withdrawn to the Shaishan trenches when news came to Sholo Shaishan High Command of the Southern Breach's capture. And then, a choice had to be made. Did they abandon the Southern Breach to return another day, or did they push now and ensure the legionnaires gallantly fighting in the south were not overrun? High Marshal Tlaloc had ordered a full assault immediately in support of the southern offensive. Gas was deployed, as before, but the issuance of crude gas masks among the Ugg blunted its usefulness, and fighting on the other 3 breaches had been brutal indeed. By dusk on the 23rd, countless thousands of the Empire's sons were dead, and he, bound to his maps and staff, could not even be there to lead them firsthand. And still, these days later, the fighting raged beneath the surface, far from his sight. His hands and blade were tied by the orders of caution the Tlatoani had handed down to him. Ichtak VI, mythic as many of his line, and taken with the wrath of Harakwe, was free to storm castles. Tlaloc, the humming brain of the machine of war, was not. This spur-of-the-moment, costly offensive was not a part of his old friend Ruhualpa's war plan north. The Empire had been fortunate, during its breaching and capture of the First Wall, to see all the tokens fall cleanly into place, just as the prior High Marshal had intended. This was not something Ruhualpa would likely have expected, had he still drawn breath to see it. Indeed, one of Ruhualpa's favorite lines from the Bastion of Will to recite in conversation was the old adage that no plan of war ever survived contact with an enemy. But warm as Ruhualpa could be in conversation over pipe or stroll, in command he was cold as a winter in the deepest Idalands, unmoving, mechanical, unflappable. Had news of unexpected turns on the field come to the tent, or, in this case, occupied farmhouse, of Ruhualpa Mirakanchi, the man would have sighed, shaken his head, and then spoken with the decisiveness of a general who had already foreseen such setbacks. Tlaloc was not so frigid. As a legate among prestigious Ektal legions, almost all of his experience had been during peacetime. Tlaloc had served in the Eztlan uprising and the breaking of the siege of Kushkotlan, but in both cases, even at his high rank, he had been just one moving part in a vast machinery of war, which, for the most part, did his deciding for him. It was quite another thing to speak with the authority High Marshal Ruhualpa had once wielded and attempt in the speaking to mean it. Clearly, Ruhualpa had believed him capable. Though Tlaloc had taken the rank of High Marshal in a desperate rush at the urging of Ichtak VI, purely due to the unshakable loyalty the then legate had held for Ruhualpa, the new Tlatoani had confided that, upon taking the dais, he had found in the Kandari's private quarters testament that Tlaloc was to have been one of the nominees to the position anyhow. This seemed to have sealed in the mind of Ichtak VI that High Marshal Tlaloc was meant to be, and he had upheld his early decision with confidence so iron that Tlaloc himself had begun to believe. But with the towering presence of the young master away, his old doubt was settling heavy again. He gazed, as he often had these past few hours, at the ugly little idol on the altar beneath the westward window, the sole portal to the exterior in the alien clay walls of the room. It was a little carven thing of dry wood, depicting a tall man and a short, plump woman, arm in arm. The male was Ugg and the female Lautani, or so Tlaloc had thought, though the very harsh and angular construction of the thing made certainty difficult to his untrained eye. Perhaps it was meant to be their wicked, child-eating gods. He believed he remembered a priest telling him once that Laut was ever fat with children. The idol had likely been hand-carved by the farmer, perhaps, given its age, by one of his forefathers. Through the window behind them, the sun was setting, bathing the intertwined figures in an orange and red glow, and deepening the shadows of their strange, lumpen faces. He flicked the idol over, so that the pair were no longer looking on him. The shuffling, so common to the outer rooms of his temporary abode, gave way to the thump of boots and the subtle groans of well-made metal. Tlaloc turned for the heavy linen drape that barred the doorway, and waited for the thump of an announcing knock on the wall. "Legate Ishpehualtia of the Ektal First Legion to see you, High Marshal," came the voice of his attendant. "Let him in," Tlaloc said. The figure who pushed in was a sight so terrible it gave even Tlaloc, who had witnessed the killing pits above Eztlan in the last war, pause. Legate Ishpehualtia had to stoop to enter the room, regardless of the height of the Ugg-built doorway. The destroyer plate of the First Legion was red and brown with the fluids of the slain, some fresh and glistening, some dull and earthen after days drying. Tracts of it were singed with the ministrations of the enemy's flame. The great crest of feathers denoting his rank and the honor given him by the Tlatoani, which had stood tall and proud on his back days prior, was stained and bent and battered. One of the canisters of the gas mask built into the heavy helm had been ruptured like a splitting flower bud by a bullet or fragment, and dozens of other dents and warps across chest or thigh or shoulder spoke to many impacts shrugged off in the struggle. The snouted helm was tugged free of the sealed collar, and the face beneath was no less terrible than the dour-scarred plate had been. The Ektal First Legion, clad in their destroyer plate, had revived the ritual consecration of old in their fervor for echoing the paladins of yesteryear. The blood of Ugg captured upon the first wall was shipped back by rail from distant Shahuitzul for the use of priests in the field, and some was set aside for the First Legion. The battle rite of consecration itself dated back to the founding, when the armor-clad companions of the founder himself had bathed in the blood of the Ida minders before emerging onto the surface to slaughter their erstwhile masters. And so Ishpehualtia, along with his fervent men, had knelt chanting before priests of the Lord of War in the pale light of dawn on the morning the offensive had begun in earnest. The caps of their helms were filled with the blood of the sacrificed, and turned upon their heads like the cleansing waters of a Lautani priestess before the seals to the gorget were made. The metallic scent of blood accepted by the old general below was said to breathe the heat of Harakwe's molten blood into the consecrated, and Tlaloc, who had heard the Ektal First Legion baying for yet more blood as they issued forth towards the wall all those hours ago, did not doubt it. The face of Legate Ishpehualtia was, despite the calm and collected poise, something out of a vision of the distant past. Glorious, but horrible. The coif of steel-strong silk and padding beneath was stained brown with long-dried sacrificial lifeblood, and Tlaloc's keen ears heard the subtle crackle of the residue as the layer was stripped away to reveal the shaven head beneath. Sholoshaishans, bare and peltless over most of their forms as they are, have ever been one of the few among the kindreds capable of producing sweat, something which served them well during long years of conquest fighting and marching under metal plate and scale. The sweat of exertion had split the dried ichor caking Ishpehualtia's face as it settled, and now it looked to the High Marshal as if the cool, bright eyes there stared out from amidst a forest of dull and stinking scales. The legate's sawn-off shotgun was holstered, but his maquahuit hung notched and well-used in his hand, still unsheathed, not to be put away until cleaning and sharpening could be done. All breaches are captured, and all major artery tunnels below the fortress are in our hands, High Marshal, Ishpehualtia announced. Losses were heavier than before, but we have come away with far more captives to send home. You will have your figures by tomorrow morning, I'm sure, but I'll assure you now we still have more than enough men to break open Sir Girkar. Tlaloc nodded, some of the weight seeming to drift silently off his shoulders. "Harakwe graces us with much greater swiftness than I'd anticipated," he said. "You've done well. You should wash and rest, Ishpehwaltia. You've been awake at least 3 days. We'll be marching for Sirgirkar tomorrow at sunrise." "I will, High Marshal," Ishpehwaltia told him. "We all need sleep, in truth. But I wished to ask about the next fittings for plate. The 2nd through 4th Ektal Infantry Legions from Tepeklan were slated to receive their own armor from the capital by the end of the month. The men are eager to begin acclimating to the weight. Word among the Ektal in our trenches was that it has been diverted. Is this true?" "Not all of it," Tlaloc assured him. "My understanding is the Tlatoani himself requested a portion of the plate be altered to suit a legion of his own, back in the south. There should still, I would imagine, be enough for at least the 2nd and 3rd legions. Our craftsmen here will make any alterations of fit which need to be seen to. The 4th will have its own hide soon enough." "The world will quake when all the Ektal from all our provinces have been outfitted," Ishpehwaltia said, his grin stark against the filth caking his face. "The plan is to have all of them ready by year's end, before the assault on the islands," Tlaloc explained. "High Marshal Ruhualpa, may he strike well on the fields of fire and war below, wished to have enough tanks to carry the armored Ektal into battle ahead of the army legions as breachers. He placed the orders more than 6 months ago. Trust in the craftsmen of the Empire. The land ships will come slower than the plate, but they will come." Ishpehwaltia nodded. He was looking down at the squat, toppled idol on the altar to the High Marshal's side. Perhaps the large man wished to ask about news from the south, news Tlaloc did not know and could not give him. He would not have been the first legate of the Ektal to attempt the conversation. But when at last he spoke, Ishpehwaltia refrained. "I've also been told to give you a request," Ishpehwaltia said. "Legate Tewas of the Ektal 1st Legion of Eztlan. We've all heard there are Lautani Marines being ferried into Sirgirkar for the siege. Legate Tewas wishes his men to be deployed directly against them, wherever the islanders end up. I will keep him in mind when the Volvine get close enough for their observation flights, and we have a better idea of what waits for us west," Tlaloc said. "Has he made a good account of himself?" "Yes, of course," Ishpehwaltia assured him. "The Eztlan Lautani are the reason the southern push was so fast and so brutal after all. Unruly, perhaps, but they have the molten spirit. I was too far north to be witness to any of the exploits of Legate Tewas, but the communications officers are saying he and his men killed the Prince of Gunug at the southern breach. Shame he couldn't be dragged alive back to Shahwitzul. It would have made a more fitting end for him. Perhaps the Sun King himself will not be so fortunate as to die before I find him." Legate Ishpehwaltia, after a moment's silence, saluted, branded palm aloft, saying, "I will take my rest as commanded, High Marshal. May you find your own before dawn." Tlaloc returned the gesture as the legate hobbled out on uninjured but exhausted legs. Then he faced the window and watched the sun as it finished its descent. Through a distant pasture, ranks of stripped, collared Ugg chained neck to neck were being driven up to the roadway, where a convoy of trucks would carry them to the commandeered rail lines, and beyond these, a stream of teeming, singing Sholo-Shaishan reserves was beginning the evening march up to their new camps along the breaches of the second wall. He thought of old tales, of lion folk skulking east across the river into the lands of Harakwe with spears in hand to prey on their folk, while the Shaishans reeled under the venom and fang of old foes. Tlaloc had his worries, his doubts of his fitness for his role. but his heart swelled to see so treacherous a people brought so low, and the fires of his courage were stoked. There would never again be another war of the two traitors, of the Duumvirate and Gunug against the proud empire. 4,000 years of contest brought to this, and Tlaloc, for all his fretting over detail and all his flaw, was fortunate enough to be alive to see it. High Marshal Tlaloc reached down and righted the simple idol. But rather than facing it inward towards home and hearth, he perched it on the sill of the window, facing out into the growing gloom.